Hi, this is the Demographics Decoded podcast with me, demographer Simon Kuestenmacher.
And me, Michael Yardney, property and wealth creation expert. And this is the podcast where we unveil the trends shaping our futures. Now, today we're going to shift gears to discuss something that impacts almost every aspect of our lives, our cars. Hey, did you like that little lead into cars with shifting gears? Look, as we look ahead in the next decade, it promises to have some significant changes on how we drive, how we live, where we drive, what we drive. So, Simon, I know you've recently written a series of articles about the future dominated by cars. You think it's going to be in a way we haven't seen before. So, Simon, let's put the pedal to the metal and start with this. How are the demographic trends directly going to influence our cars' ownership sales over the next year or two?
Yeah, the first observation here is that we must ignore the broader general narratives that say things like, oh, millennials, they haven't taken their driver's tests as soon as previous generations. Millennials, they care more about the environment. They will not drive as much. These are all trends that are true to a certain degree, but they will not nearly be strong enough to shift broader demographic trends that are pointing towards the decade of the car. What I mean by this is there is a certain kind of geographical logic to what car usership you have in your day-to-day life. And we discussed it in previous podcasts. What we're doing over the next 12 years, we take all of the millennials that currently still live in the inner city hipster apartment areas of our big cities, and as they make their 1.5 babies, they move to the urban fringe. Because that's the only place where family-sized housing is available and affordable in Australia. And so while you might have gotten away with maybe just one car per household, maybe even no car per household in your hipster suburb, you could cycle, you could take the tram, that worked. But now that you put your belongings in a truck, you move to the urban fringe, you move into car-dependent areas, you will definitely need more cars. So we take the biggest cohort in Australia, millennials, out of the least car-dependent area of the city, and we put them bit by bit in the most car-dependent area of our cities. That will very much have an impact on car usership, of car ownership, and in a sense that it drives up the number of cars on the road.
So, interestingly, Simon, I hadn't thought about that, but as I'm thinking of people I know, a lot of the younger generations don't get their license when they're 18. They don't need it. They can get away without it. I remember when I was young, the day I turned 18, I went for my driver's test. There weren't P plates at the time. I studied beforehand, and I know some people even went interstate in New South Wales. You could get your licence at 16, so they actually rushed to get the licence even earlier. Today, there doesn't seem to be the urgency because we have, if you live in the right areas, a pretty good public transport system.
Yes, it has to do with the public transport system. It also has to do with the sexual revolution of all things. Because back in the olden days, it would have been absolutely unthinkable for a teenager to bring their suitor back home to their childhood bedroom. So to speak. And so therefore the car actually did provide, we always said it provided freedom, but it did also provide sexual freedom to a degree.
That's really interesting that you mentioned that because I didn't get my first car till I was 24. I used to borrow my parents' car. In fact, I owned two properties before I owned a car. But I did like my father's car rather than my mother's car because it had a bench seat rather than bucket seats.
I wonder why. But that's all those little social trends in the background. They influence things like car ownerships and the kind of keenness of a population to get cars. So we do know that young people, of course, live at home for longer. We do know that they have more sexual freedoms than previous generations. And so these elements push the keenness for car ownership, or at least the driver's license, a bit further back. But it doesn't mean that we completely forego the idea of driving cars, because sooner or later you need them just to operate in the cities that we live in, because our cities are still overwhelmingly, for better or worse, car dependent in nature. So I think the most environmentally minded millennial did get away cycling in an inner city. That's cool, wonderful. But you will not get away without a car on the urban fringe where you're now moving in order to afford a house. So we'll see car ownership go up there. And that's written into the demographic future, because we are making babies. Yes, we make them at a lower rate, but predictably make babies. And the only place where housing is affordable is the fringe. So that's the geographic element that's already pushing this. The reason, of course, that we probably have people with dual cars, two or maybe even three cars per household on the urban fringe, has to do with the lack of public infrastructure on the urban fringe. We are growing out of cities at a much faster rate from a population perspective than we add infrastructure. So while we might say to our people in the growth corridors of yesteryear, of the last 10 years, we might have promised them train stations that they're still waiting for, we are doing the same empty promises for the new growth corridors on the outskirts. We say, yes, Woolert in Melbourne or whatever, we say, yeah, there'll be train stations. They will be there, but not in the next decade.
I think one of the other demographic changes, of course, Simon, is when you have children, when you have babies, you need cars. You can't really easily put those cot bassinets on the back of a bike, and so you want the security of a car. I think it also means you need a different type of car, doesn't it?
Exactly. So what we will be seeing, of course, is that once you move away from a relatively compact, small inner city area where you might be convinced to buy a small car, you then move to the urban fringe. You know that you need to lug around a bucket load of stuff for your kids all the time. You then go to an SUV type, maybe even a big van or a truck type vehicle. And that's certainly the trend over the last 10 years, is that we shifted towards bigger and bigger vehicles. It's actually an utterly fascinating history of just looking at Australia's best-selling car year by year. Throughout the
It has
80s,
changed, hasn't it?
exactly, and throughout the 80s and 90s, it always was an Australian-built model, either a Ford Falcon or a Holden Commodore, was always that, and they sold about 100 to 110,000 units. That's the most
I'm old
common.
enough to even remember before the Commodore, there used to be the Holden Kingswood. That was the family car, but you're right. You were in almost like a football club. You either believed in Fords or Holdens, didn't you?
Exactly, you had to choose your colors. Same difference, so to speak, sedan type vehicles, Australian made, roughly the same price group. So didn't matter much. But that's the dominant car. We then decided, rather smart approach from very utilitarian approach. Let's not build the second half of the car. Let's call it a ute. And you have a very functional car with a big bed. Super smart for tradies, fun to drive because it's a relatively light vehicle with a relatively strong motor, so it's fun. But that, of course, died in 2016 when we closed the Australian car manufacturing down, and then you couldn't get a small ute type Aussie ute vehicle anymore. And so if you wanted a vehicle with a bed, you had to buy a bigger truck, a vehicle almost twice the weight, probably. So these are monsters of cars. And so after the 80s, 90s, up to the mining boom, it was always those sedans that we purchased. 100,000 or thereabouts was the number sold. And then the financial crisis hit. Money is tight. We switched to an even smaller vehicle. We buy Toyota Corollas at high numbers. This is a small, practical, reliable vehicle. We buy these for a couple of years, and then in the 2010s, all of a sudden, we do better, economically speaking again, and we start buying Hiluxes and Ford Rangers. And while all of the big cars, if you look at the top 10 now, they are all SUVs or trucks. We really went up. Carbesity, autobesity are the terms that are sometimes used to describe this, that we now drive Ford Rangers, for example, that literally do not fit into our garages. Very few people can afford a garage that is large enough to fit their car if they drive a Ford Ranger. And so these cars are now parked on public car parks, on side streets. These are very wide cars, so sometimes in inner city environments, they're actually by definition illegally parked because they don't fit into the markers. And so what do you do there? These are lots of regulation problems that we try to figure out how to tackle with it. Should we increase the legal sizes of garages? Should we just say, well, you're just parked illegally, this is a great revenue source for local government? We don't know how this is playing out, but bit by bit, we always in forecasting say regulation follows innovation. The big cars must be viewed as the innovation here, and we are now bit by bit regulating them. We might tax them more. We might want to make them more unattractive as a vehicle, which is what the Parisians are doing, for example. Are we that restrictive? I don't think so, to be honest. I think that we'll just deal with more big vehicles and just, have tighter street rooms available. But again, difficult challenges. But of course, there is more to this. There's also psychological arms race towards why we have bigger vehicles. It's a bit like the pandemic when we all bought toilet paper. Nobody bought toilet paper because they thought COVID made them poop more. They all bought toilet paper because they thought those morons are buying toilet paper. Because of those morons, I don't have toilet paper. I don't need to buy toilet paper. It's people that go, I would be happy with a sedan. But if everyone buys a big SUV, I'm relatively less safe in a crash. So now I need to buy a bigger vehicle. And so it's just a matter of time until we all drive tanks, according to this simplified logic. But there is an arms race element in it, where you want, in order to ensure your family car's safety, you buy a bigger, stronger vehicle. And that, of course, makes driving safer for people in the vehicle. But for people outside of the vehicle, a pedestrian collision is much more fun when you're being hit by a Ford Falcon than when you're being hit by a Ford Ranger. Yeah.
Simon, is there another element to it as well, especially for males, and I don't mean to be sexist, but the car's a symbol of their masculinity?
It is. It's quite important that we know we do not make rational decision in purchasing. That's true for most products. It's absolutely true for cars because it is a very visible purchase that you make. And when I last purchased a car, I did my research and I found a beautiful article in a car magazine about the latest Toyota Camry. And it had all those, it's one of those articles that ends with a list of pluses and minuses. And all of the pluses were wonderful. A long list of pluses. Great mileage, super cheap insurance, very reliable, the cheapest to maintain car in the country, marvelous, safest sedan in the country, wonderful list. And it only had one minus, the whole article. And the one minus was you will be mistaken for an Uber driver. And I thought that actually hinted at a nice truism here, is if we would make any kind of rational decision about a car, a Jaguar, a Bentley, a Porsche, a Mercedes wouldn't exist. These are companies that exist because we want to have a bit of luxury, because we want to display a certain image about ourselves to the rest of the world or to ourselves, whatever it is. And so that's where these big cars come in. If you look at the Ford Rangers, for example, an absolute ridiculously small amount of Ford Rangers are actually utilized by tradies who tow stuff and who carry heavy loads. They are suburban vehicles. You don't need to have such a strong motor. You don't need to have a bed at the end of your car for most users. But it's a fun car to drive for people. It feels safe, whatever it is. And they're, of course, perfectly legally allowed to drive these cars. But there is a psychological argument that you make.
You're right. In fact, both Pam and I have Bentleys, but if you look further back, you actually know that Bentley is no longer really an English car. It's owned by Volkswagen. So we now both have Volkswagens with some wood in them and pay a lot more than we would if it was a Volkswagen.
That's it.
So, yes, it is, I guess, a statement in some ways. Now, there's also been a change with electric cars, and it started with the Tesla, but now it seems that there's a lot more Chinese imported cars, and many of them being electric cars, Simon.
Exactly. So we are shifting to electric cars. So electric cars do make up a higher share of all new cars, bit by bit. That's a very positive and fun development, and especially the increase of Teslas and BYDs are impressive. We now have 160,000 Teslas, I think, on the road, and about 50,000 BYDs out of 15 million or close to 16 million cars. So it's still a very small share. We have about 1% of the fleet electric at the moment. So it's not all that impressive, but it is increasing. And we want to, of course, remember a bit about the basic arguments of cars, basic statistics here. There's a beautiful thing called the Australian Vehicle Census. And so from this, we learned, for example, the average age of a car in Australia. It's 11.2 years of age.
Really?
So, yeah, because it is quite old. It's even older in Tasmania, which has the oldest fleet. 13 and a half years is the vehicle there, because it is even more expensive to get a car into Tasmania compared to Victoria. You need to have yet one more shipping cycle in there. So yet one more middle person essentially who wants a cut. And of course, this runs down to insurance and spare parts and so forth. So you'd rather run your car a bit longer in Tasmania. And Tasmania, of course, also is, just more driving trivia, the most car dependent or car heavy state in this country. So we measure vehicles per 1,000 people, not just driving age people, total population. And in Tasmania, we have 942 cars per 1,000 residents. That is much higher than the average of around 800 cars. And so I think that's just interesting to understand. If you have a little island, Tasmania, without any rail-based public transport, everything is road-based. Of course, more people have cars. All public transport is bus-based in Tasmania. And so we rely on the cars in Tasmania, but we really drive them into the ground. And quite often, essentially, our Australian cars are being driven into the ground because we might sell them. There, of course, is important to remember in the back of our minds when we think about what are we doing when we want to electrify the national fleet. And of course, we do this from a fleet management perspective. Let's say you run a vehicle fleet for this could be a Lindfox, this could be a supermarket, this could be any kind of business that owns a couple of cars, and you have certain climate targets that says we need to be carbon neutral by 2035 or something like this. You go, that's actually just probably like 2 lease cycles away.
Yeah.
So how do you transition this bit by bit? Because all those climate targets are set for the mid-30s. Everyone will want to have those cars then. So you're probably better off transitioning now in advance before you have to reach those targets, because the competition for those vehicles might get bigger towards the end. And so there's a bit of strategic foresight in there in fleet management as well. But of course, we know where the trend is going. Even though we have 1% of cars, of vehicles in Australia electric, this will get much, much bigger. But of course, we now had the phase where all the real enthusiasts already bought their electric cars. And now we're waiting for it to go mainstream. So there's always this lull. After the initial phase of enthusiasm, there's a bit of a lull. And then eventually it becomes mainstream, and we'll bit by bit will switch the fleets to electric.
Let's talk a bit about infrastructure, because we know our roads are very busy, but you and I speak each week about the demographic trends. We know our population's growing. We know the government's wanting to slow it down a bit, but clearly we're still going to have a lot more people. I've read statistics that by 2041 we're going to have another 1.5 million people in Australia. And based on average ratio of cars to people, that means we're really roughly going to have an additional 1 million more cars on the road in less than 20 years. Plus, there's going to be all the commercial vehicles. And in fact, we know that of those people coming to Australia, the majority of them are actually going to cluster in Melbourne, Sydney and southeast Queensland. So I can see our roads only getting more cluttered and worse. Is the infrastructure going to cope at all, Simon?
Well, there is going to be a lot of pressure on infrastructure. That's absolutely correct. We found one way of softening this pressure. That's working from home. So if you work from home more frequently, you take cars off the road to a certain degree. So that softens this kind of pressure. But at the moment, we have 2 future scenarios that are being discussed. One is the scenario of more cars, more clutter. Where the hell do we put all those cars? That's the stressful narrative. I would argue that's the more likely narrative, but the other alternative is also really interesting because it takes into account the fact that at no point in time are there more than 10% of cars driving. Always 90% of cars are parked. That means if we were to forgo with the concept of individual car ownership, and we would make sure that all cars are self-driving, and we just imagine that whenever you need a vehicle, you call one, like an Uber, a self-driving Uber. If you need a big car comes. If you need a small car comes, because it's cheaper, so you save a couple of bucks. And in this scenario, you would easily get away to manage a city, a country, with, well, probably 20 to 30% of the current fleet. So you would then all of a sudden have the opposite problem of, oh, we don't have enough room for all the cars. It would be, oh my God, there's so much car parks that become available for public use. We could create street trees there, greenery. We could utilize whole car parks with public services or with housing. This would be quite marvelous. This is the scenario where urban planners just cry tears of joy even thinking about them. But so will this be a mixture of both scenarios so that in net terms absolutely nothing changes? We don't know. But it's absolutely crucial to think about what the future technology of cars would look like. The reason why I'm not all that optimistic about us going to this fully self-driving, automated future of vehicles is that I'm just thinking about who would not have an interest in ensuring that the car fleet shrinks by about 70%. That's car manufacturers.
Yes.
So I'd say self-driving vehicles are actually the death nail for the nail in the coffin for the car industry. So would they actually push this? I don't know. So the ultimate network that would run these cars, the platform, the Uber platform, so to speak, they would like that. Maybe even as some sort of like strong authoritarian government would like that. But I don't know how this will play out, to be honest.
I think we've also got to understand where we're using our cars, how we're using them, and for a lot of us it's to go to and from work. And a lot of people think, oh, it's all in the CBD. In fact, I've read that only about 10% of all the jobs are actually in the CBD. And most of the people who work in the CBD, for obvious reasons, live closer to the CBD. Only about 5% or fewer people who work in the CBD live in the outer suburbs, I guess, again, for obvious reasons. And many inner city workers living close tend to use public transport. But we keep talking about in these shows how the health industry, the aged care industry is going to keep growing. And I guess those jobs are going to occur more in the middle ring and outer suburbs, the aged care homes, the nursing homes. So people are still going to need to get around where public transport doesn't take them, Simon.
Exactly. And so I would not see the car is going away. And of course, you want to remember that in Australia, we still operate extremely large cities. We have low population density. Our cities on average are about 4 times lower in population density than a European city. That means you can't possibly create a European style public transport network. It just doesn't add up. It gets too expensive. You need to pay for too many kilometers of road, of rail to run this. So it is a more individualized, car-based transport system. But car-based could be road-based. Let's put it this way. And so we will think about what kind of innovation might be there. So I'm thinking about the bus network, for example. In many areas of our cities, the bus network is the only way of getting around with public transport. And bus drivers are the oldest workforce in Australia. We have close to 2/3 of bus drivers over 55. So we are running out of them quite quickly. So the connectivity of our public bus network is at severe risk. We will not have big self-driving buses anytime soon, but we will very soon have van-sized self-driving vehicles. So we could think about more individualized public transport, self-driving solutions that are much smarter in terms of more flexible routes and so forth, depending on who's wanting to travel. So these are at least thinkable at the moment. How exactly this will play out, we have no idea because no area in the world has done this just yet. We have a couple of self-driving shuttle buses from A to B, but that's not what I'm talking about here. We're talking about covering a big city with a massive amount of buses in a flexible way. We will have some sort of innovation at some point, but I don't know how.
Well, in my suburb, there are big buses driving down the streets, almost always empty. I guess in peak hour, kids going to school, maybe people going to the train station, they're busy, but they seem to keep those big diesel eating buses on the road. We don't seem to have an efficient bus system at the moment.
No, it's
Not the
difficult.
shuttle buses that you were talking about.
Yeah. No. If we talk at the general bus system, of course, because these are not on rails, they are prone to just traffic jams as well, even if they have dedicated bus lanes. And so you do have the bus problem where you sit at the bus stop and no bus comes for ages, and then 3 buses arrive. And so then the first bus fills up, and then the second 2 buses are essentially empty. So you have this in a system. Managing a bus network is actually incredibly difficult. And of course, we have the labor shortage on top. And of course, there's a bit of social stigma in Australia still that says bus driving is essentially a low income mode of public transport. We have that in the country. So unless it's for a short, convenient bus trip, I think people rather drive if they can. And Australians rather drive quite often is just the answer to any public transport or transport problem. Yeah, so I understand this, that we often see buses that are far below capacity.
Well, putting all this together then, is there anything that you suggest urban planners or governments should do to take some of the pressure off our roads? Because there's no doubt that it's only going to increase moving forward.
Yeah, so quite often the idea to alleviate road pressure is actually not so much linked to do with traffic itself, but it's the idea of how can we avoid traffic. And avoiding traffic would be we ensure that we cluster populations and jobs closer together. Then we minimize commuting times. This is by creating walkable communities. Then you'll have automatically more people doing their daily shopping, maybe with a bicycle, maybe by walking to the shops just to get, the loaf of bread. You act according to the most convenient mode of transport. And if the most convenient mode of transport always is the car, you will always choose the car. So there is the urban planning narrative there. And of course, it's policies like working from home. In Melbourne, we'll do this. We will be the working from home capital forever onwards because we are more sprawled out than other cities in Melbourne. So that will soften the transport problems of Melbourne for a while, but it eventually catches up with you. It always catches up with you.
Is it also a cultural thing? You're from Europe. When we travel in Europe, you see cities like Amsterdam and others where everyone rides a bike. Nobody has a car in town. And there were cities in countries I've been around that actually in Europe that don't allow cars into the CBD at all.
Exactly. So these are solutions that you pull in a city where you want to have public and active transport in the inner city. You then make it incredibly hard and expensive for cars to enter the inner city. You'd have this option, but in Australia this doesn't make too much sense because we're too reliant on it, and you can only introduce such restrictive measures if you have really attractive and clear alternatives. And we don't have this. If you think about getting to any CBD in Australia, there's certain suburbs where you can easily jump on a train or tram and you're in the city. You go like, oh, cool. So, these suburbs wouldn't suffer from this. But there are plenty of pockets that need to enter the CBD where the car is the only viable option. And you can't create a policy like this when to hurt big cohorts in a city. There's no social justification or backing for these kind of policies then. So I don't think we'll see this. I think we will actually be, from a policy setting, not very anti-car. In Australia, we might act a bit more in favor of active transport. So we'll see hopefully more safe and secure cycling paths, because we know that cycling is, and this is of course the European speaking, the best mode of transport, fantastic public health benefits, zero emissions. You put endless cyclists on a relatively low stretch of the road. It improves traffic flow for car riders as well. So it's the ultimate jackpot. But of course, if you look at an Australian city, some of them are not built for cars. Brisbane, very hilly for cycling,
Not built for cycling, yeah.
bikes. So it's a very hilly city. So which is why e-scooters took off in Brisbane like crazy. So that's a challenge. Melbourne, nice and flat. Cars are, of course, the number one option, but you have a fair chance of getting cycling more popular in Melbourne through smart
Well, they've been
policies.
putting cycle lanes in, haven't they, Simon? But that's created a lot of public outcry as well. The road users are unhappy about some of their space being taken up by cycle lanes.
Exactly. And the idea is that the individual cyclist that you encounter always is in your way as a motorist, and you then hate it. But overall, if you take motorists out of their car onto their bike, your traffic flow counterintuitively actually improves rather than they hinder you. Of course, there are beach roads or whatever in Brighton where you have endless armies of Lycra weekend warriors impede road traffic. That's no two opinions about this. But that's, of course, a cultural phenomenon that you then just accept that there is shared road space and cars are actually sharing the roads with cyclists. They have no primacy on the road, just in a legal structure. Only if it's a motorway, it's actually for motors. Other than this, you can have endless cycles on the road. It's perfectly legal, even though it's super annoying for motorists.
Well, it's interesting how you at the demographics group do this study about, it's not just about property that we talk a lot about or generations, but how it affects us practically, and the cars is a really good example of that. I know that you spend much of your days educating and informing businesses, organisations and government authorities. That's what you do as your job. Most people sort of wonder, what does a demographer do?
Yeah, it's exactly that. We do talk to anyone who might have a problem, and we try to look at their problem through the demographic lens. So we are essentially in the business of showing you the world through just one more perspective. I'm well and truly of the belief that if you view any issue from multiple angles, from multiple perspectives, you'll be able to make better decisions afterwards. And we provide you one perspective, one additional perspective, the demographic perspective.
Well, I'll leave a link in the show notes of how people can find out about you and the demographics group and book you to give a talk to their organisation, their company, their industry. We regularly do these demographics decoded shows, and if you've enjoyed this, we don't always talk about cars, we talk about the trends shaping your future, and you don't currently subscribe to this show, wherever you're watching this on YouTube or listening to this on your favourite podcast app, just subscribe so once a week you get the information Simon and I have got to offer. And please do us a favour. We don't put ads into this, so the best way of us getting more people to listen to this information is for people like you who are listening to us just to tell one person about the show if you got some benefit from it. That would do us a real favour. Simon, I look forward to catching up with you again next week.
Fantastic. Will be great fun next week as well.
This Demographics Decoded podcast has been brought to you by Metropole Property Strategists. We provide a complete range of services to help our clients safely create intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you're looking to buy an investment property or your next home, why not have a discovery chat with one of our wealth strategists? Just go to metropole.com.au and explore your options. You'll find we're much more than just another buyer's agent. We provide a complete range of services, including property advisory, wealth advisory, home buying, buyer's agency, property management, renovations, and development management services. The team at Metropole will help you with frameworks that I've fine-tuned over 5 decades and we've been helping clients with for well over 25 years. We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. In between these Demographics Decoded shows, you can follow me on social media, and I suggest you also follow Simon Kuestenmacher. You'll find him regularly posting on all social media platforms. And thanks for spending the last little while with Simon and me. I hope you got some benefit from the show. And if you did, and you know somebody who may also benefit, please tell them about Demographics Decoded. There's a share button on every podcast app. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you're definitely going to be doing us a favour, helping us in our quest to make as many people as possible aware of the demographic changes that are going to be shaping their future. And of course, if you don't currently subscribe, we'd love you to. And of course, any of the information that we've been sharing with you is general information because we don't know your specific circumstances.